Alright, guys, this is going to be just a quick compilation of things to keep in mind, for those of you who are venturing onto your own little exploration of Norse mythology and old Icelandic literature. Um, from what I can find, I can't seem to find anything resembling study guides or anything on Icelandic texts or Norse mythology in general. But at least as far as the Icelandic literature, there are several things that I find important to keep. A lot of these authors and writers and people piled these works and this literature were were skulls and poets and even lawmakers and educated men of their time, and it was a lot of it was during the late stages of the Icelandic Commonwealth. The 11 and 1200s are very predominant in this, both for the sagas and the Edda, so the poetry and the accounts on Norse mythology, and then the accounts on Vikings and heroic deeds and everything. This was an interesting time in Icelandic history, and I find that it's something we shouldn't skip over. We shouldn't gloss over the fact that these guys were writing in turbulent times. And I mean, just look at Snorri, and I'm a descendant of Snorri, Snorri Sturluson. That guy was a lawmaker just towards the end of the Icelandic Commonwealth, and clandestine tribal chieftain warfare was really escalating between those five major clans who had consolidated most of the power at the time. And yeah, in the end, Snorri was executed, and Iceland was brought under the King of Norway by way of some highly influential people loyal to the Norwegian king, and even in Norway there was civil unrest in Norway as well, and there were power disputes. So this was a very very tricky and turbulent time. So it, I can't help but think that may have influenced how and why they did some of this work. These writers and these authors. Um, I think to a large extent. Providing value to the future, making sure this wouldn't get lost. I do think that may have been a part of it, especially if you have a risk of a foreign power coming and subduing you. Uh, that's certainly, if you care about your cultural heritage and your identity as a nation to the extent that you have one, you might want to make sure that that heritage doesn't get lost. Also, another thing that plays a part here. This was yeah, the church was quite a force once it came in, just like anywhere else. It didn't like to be challenged very much. But still, Christianity was still very much a very new phenomenon in Iceland during this time, and some of these even prominent members of society still held the old Norse gods and deities in high regard. Many still considered openly considered Odin a hero of sorts, and to the extent that we can find in accounts, at least. You could openly talk about these figures. They wrote about it. So yeah, and with the sagas of the early settlers, yeah, it's compiled these two, maybe 300 years later, for their descendants, and there's a tiny little theory that I have that maybe it was just to maybe these guys, these tribal chieftains and warriors, were looking for inspiration, and the poets, the writers, the skulls gave it to them in the sense that they glorified their ancestors, and you can see all those exaggerated stories. But at the same time, it's when you look at the sagas of those actual real life people, those Vikings and settlers. that are written 200 or 300 years later. If you look at those, yeah, there are exaggerations probably of their heroics, but it also gives you a way of thinking and a way of approaching and things and outlook on life, outlook on reality, and quite frankly, to understand the culture from the point of view of that conflictious time a while later, I think it's somewhat important because it gives you it gives you a mentality rather than just giving you the gods and the myths and the symbols. It's also giving you the mentality of the Icelandic nation at the time of civil unrest in the 11 and 1200s respectively, and probably to some extent other periods, but throughout that time, it's that cognitive awareness and what they project onto their ancestors, what they would have wanted them to be to inspire themselves in that moment. That is it's a tiny theory of mine, but uh, take it as you may. It may or may not hold true the more you look into it. But I certainly think that understanding the Icelandic Commonwealth era, just all the way back from the settlement and the establishment of the parliament and so on, throughout the Norse period into the early Christian era, into the Civil War era, and the collapse of the Commonwealth, and looking up some of the biographies of these writers and authors, some just get a gist of who they were and how they what was their role in the midst of all what went down, and what may they have been trying to accomplish with their writing and with the work they did, not just in terms of the literature, but also the work they did outside of the literary work, out in society as a members of society. And yeah, so it's just wanted to throw these little thoughts your way primarily. Another thing is the knowledge of the language, Old Norse, and it's a beautiful thing. I haven't really, and I must admit, I haven't really given Gesta Danorum that much of a time. The big magnum opus by Saxo Grammaticus, but and I will, and I would want to give it plenty of time in the original language, and I believe he wrote in Latin originally. So, but there's something about writing in Old Norse, not just because you get the full context of the continuity of the time and progression of ideas within the context of its developing original language, but there are also just so many keys in there. Um, and another YouTuber, Lady of the Labyrinth, she pointed this out, that when they translate these texts, they don't translate the nouns. So basically, you have this translation that says in the beginning when they're going through the creation myth, but as written, it's Ár var alda, which means Ár could be early, var was alda, wave, and big wave, to be specific. And she points this out. So there's a metaphorical image in there, and it could you could translate it to in the beginning, but you can also say in the beginning there was a big wave. It's not probably not going to flow as poetically in English, and this is the problem with translations. But skipping through those kind of details, it can really kill a lot of the value texts. And I pointed this out before. It's the same when you translate Shakespeare out of the original English into other languages, and the same when you work on authors from other languages. I work a lot on old Russian classics as well, and with my poor Russian, and I keep a dictionary at hand. I keep the original text at hand, and I look at the translation, and then I look at the original text, and it's all for a reason. And I think that the same is very important here. And yeah, she's Norwegian, I think, Lady of the Labyrinth. but you know, Norwegian is very far off from Old Norse in terms of just mutual intelligibility. Icelandic is way closer. So, but I think she has a fair command of Old Norse. I haven't talked to her, so I wouldn't know. At least she seems to have a fair grasp of it. So, I be a decent scholar. So it would be, you know, if I keep doing this Norse mythology stuff, then you know maybe she'll sit down and have a conversation with me at some point, and we'll give you guys a little two-way there discussion. You know, that'll be interesting. But at any rate, yeah, there's just this is something I wanted to toss out there. When you approach any text on these subjects, get as much of the background as you can. Study the historical period to the best you can, the time and place that the authors were in, and if they mention any real life characters from before, look at that time and place. Where were they sourcing that from? Make sure you try and look at if you have, to the extent that you have access to it, the original language it was written in, keeping dictionaries at hand. If you have a hard time finding Old Norse dictionaries, at least try with an Icelandic dictionary, because that you'll find it very most of the vocabulary very accessible from that. And yeah, it's and yeah, of course, the to the extent that you can, the biographies of the and I'm basing this, so I have to give credit where credit is due. I'm basing this approach to my approach to literature and text and work off of Stella Adler, the late and great actress and acting teacher, under whose students I have studied. I'm basing my approach off of her phenomenal script analysis approach, and she was quite a titan on analyzing the every bit of literature down to she could spend a lot of work on a piece of text before opening to the first page, from what I understand from the people who study directly under her, and I think especially for historical works, it's extremely important because you're working with something crafted by people whose whose concept of the world and of life and view of everything was very different from ours, different from yours and mine as well. I'm currently living in a modern world. I've been to parts of it and seen context that they weren't exposed to, and vice versa. Uh, so I would have to adapt to what if I take this exposure out as something I couldn't have had at the time. So how can I craft myself to see it as much to the extent that I can understand from what they saw, what they could have been able to see at the time, and it's a lot of work. I don't think we can do it very realistically, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying. At least to go as far as we can. Those are the 2 cents I want to give you as far as introductions into the Old Icelandic literature, historical literature in general, and just be a hawk as a scholar. Be specific, be detailed, find every bit of juice you can find everywhere. Just get as much value as you can for yourself. Anyways, have a good day, guys. Viking out.